Hello, my name is Matthew Lloyd and I am the curator here at Norwich Museum. Today I'm going to tell you about Dr. Emily Howard Jennings Stowe, the first female physician to practice medicine in Canada, who was born in the township of Norwich in 1831. Everyone in Norwich knows about Emily Stowe. We named the school after her. Outside the archives on Stowe Street, there's a plaque that tells you all about her. The first female physician to practice medicine in Canada, Emily Jennings was born in Norwich Township to Quaker parents. For some years she taught school. Then, in the early 1860s, she decided to pursue a career in medicine. Refused admission to an exclusively male institute in Toronto, Stowe enrolled in the New York Medical College for Women. She received her degree in 1867 and, returning to Canada, established a successful practice in Toronto. A passionate advocate for social reform, Stowe campaigned vigorously for increased educational opportunities for women, effectively challenging the right of Canadian universities and medical schools to exclude female students. A first president of the Dominion Women's Enfranchisement Association, 1889 to 1903, she also contributed significantly to the advancement of women's voting rights. Wow, she sounds so cool, but there's not a lot of information here about her time in Norwich. Who were her family? Where did she live? What was happening in town when she was young? So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Emily's parents were Hannah Howard and Solomon Jennings. Hannah Howard was the daughter of Paulina Lossing and Henry Howard, and Paulina Lossing was the daughter of Peter Lossing and his first wife, Hannah Brill. Peter Lossing was born in Dutchess County, New York, in 1763. He was a Quaker, a member of the Oswego Monthly Meeting of the Society of Friends. Quaker is the common name of a denomination of Protestant Christianity known formally as the Religious Society of Friends. Founded in the mid-17th century by George Fox, women played a significant part in the religion's early development and spread, especially Margaret Fell. Indeed, many central beliefs in Quakerism ensured the active role of women within their organization, including the concept that each person has the light of God within them, and thus can have their own relationship with God. Educated, literate women, such as Margaret Fell, ensured that women played an important role in the Society of Friends from the beginning, and Quakers continued to believe in the importance of educating women and men alongside one another. Peter Lossing married Hannah Brill on the 15th of October, 1781, and they had 4 sons and 2 daughters, including Paulina. In 1806, Peter married again. His second wife was Catherine de Long, making him the brother-in-law of Peter de Long, with whom, in 1810, he bought 15,000 acres of land in what was then Upper Canada and is currently the township of Norwich. When the 2 Peters, along with several other families, made their way to Norwich in the autumn of 1810, Paulina did not go with them. She had married Henry Howard, a man from Cranston, Rhode Island, and they had recently had a daughter, Hannah Howard, who would be Emily's mother. When the settlers were heading off to Norwich, Henry had been sick and, by the end of 1810, he died, leaving Paulina a widow and a single mother. In the meantime, Peter Lossing and his sons had reached Norwich, leaving their wives and sisters in Burford while they cleared the land and constructed a house. Through the winter of 1810 to 1811, they constructed the house that now stands on the museum property, and Peter wrote to his eldest daughter back in New York State about their progress. Paulina intended to follow her father and siblings to Norwich, but in 1812 war intervened, as the United States declared war on British North America. Paulina and her father continued to correspond, and in early 1815 he devised a ploy by which Paulina and Hannah might sneak into Upper Canada with a group of Quakers giving permission to attend their yearly meeting in New York State. However, the Treaty of Ghent that ended the war had been signed in December 1814 and was soon ratified by the US Congress, so in the end they were able to travel to Canada freely. Once she and Hannah reached Norwich, Paulina lived in the family home until she met George Southwick, a fellow Quaker whom she married in December of 1815. Theirs was one of the first marriages among the settlers of Norwich, although the wedding took place at the Pelham Friends Meeting House, as there was not yet a meeting house in Norwich itself. Hannah Howard grew up on the Southwick farm in the southeast corner of the township, with her mother, stepfather, and an increasing number of siblings, until she was 16. At this age, she returned to the United States to attend the Friends Yearly Meeting boarding school, also known as the Providence Seminary, in Rhode Island. As Quakers believed in radical equality and had a history of educating girls and boys alongside one another, this school was co-educational, and she may have met Solomon Jennings while she was there. Solomon Jennings was born in 1802 to John Jennings and Elizabeth Clark of Vermont. He and Hannah were married in 1830, and they moved to Norwich to live alongside her mother and stepfather. On May 1st, 1831, Hannah gave birth to her first daughter, Emily Howard Jennings. The 1830s, however, were a turbulent time in Norwich. The original land survey in the township of Norwich had not been a very good job. Boundaries were unclear, leading to disputes, and patches of land around the settlement that were owned by the Crown or the Church of England had been left in a state of wilderness that was distressing to hard-working Quakers like Peter Lossing. There was much local support for the reform movement, including from Emily's father, Solomon Jennings, which would break the corrupt family compact that controlled political decisions in Upper Canada at the time. But even when the Reform Party had control of the legislature, their Tory opponents still had the ear of the Lieutenant General, preventing anything from being done about the problems underlying the province. For a fuller account of the rebellion of 1837 in Norwich, you can watch our video from the first Oxford Local History Day in 2021. But it was the context of Emily Howard Jennings' first decade, and her family was deeply embroiled in the whole affair. Her father's role in the rebellion is unclear, but he is known to have been a supporter of Oxford's Reform MP Dr. Charles Duncombe. Like Duncombe, Emily's mother, Hannah, had a dim view of the state of public education in Upper Canada and resolved to homeschool her children, starting with Emily. Emily's great-uncle, Solomon Lossing, was implicated in the rebellion and was even arrested at one point. Her father was supposed to be a witness at Lossing's trial, but he did not appear on the day. When the militia occupied Norwich in the winter of 1837 to 1838, the house of Emily's grandparents, Paulina and George Southwick, was searched. But fortunately for them, the rebel they were hiding was not discovered. We do not know that Emily's home, which was next to her grandparents', was searched, but it may well have been. Similarly, Emily may have been at the Quaker meeting where the militia requisitioned several wagons from the attendees, forcing women and young children to walk several miles home. Emily would have been 6 years old during the events of the rebellion, and her biographer, Mary Beacock Fryer, argues that it would have been a formative experience for her. Watching her family stand up for beliefs that they considered noble and being met by intimidation and violence, she would have seen the forces of injustice levelled against them. Yet, in the long term, the demands the rebels had been making began to be met, and the militia leader in charge of the occupation of the town was removed as a magistrate, resigned his commission, and ended his public career. Fryer argued that this would have taught Emily that persistence and standing up to intimidation paid off in the long term. Hannah and Solomon had 6 more children after Emily: Cornelia, Paulina, Ethelinda, John Milton, Hannah Augusta, and Ella. Their only son, John, was born in April 1844 and died in September 1844, leaving a family of 6 daughters. While other farms in the middle of the 19th century might have struggled with no sons, a Quaker family such as the Jennings did not see daughters as an obstacle. All 6 girls were put to work on the farm milking cows, making clothes, furniture, candles, and soap, preserving food for the winter, and filling the barn loft with hay. Hannah taught the girls at home, believing that they should receive as good an education as possible. It is likely that they learnt natural and herbal medicine. Hannah was well known in Norwich for her remedies made using roots and herbs. While Norwich had several doctors, it was still an isolated community, and practical medical knowledge could be life-saving on the farm. Education in what had recently become Canada West was improving. An Act of 1843 had created local superintendents of education, and in Norwich, 1846, this was the former Revel Dr. Ephraim Cook. Cook chose Emily, then only 15 years old, as the teacher of the one-room schoolhouse in Somerville, a small community around the 10th concession in the south of Norwich. Despite teaching some children who were older and larger than her, Emily took strongly to teaching and continued to do so across the area for 7 years, including in Burgessville in 1849 to 1850. During this time, her father gave up farming and moved into the village of Norwich, making a living by buying and selling land. After 7 years of teaching, in 1853 at age 22, Emily decided that she wanted more education for herself. She applied to Victoria College in Coburg, Ontario, but was told that she was not eligible for admission because she was a woman. For someone who had been raised in the Quaker belief that women were equally deserving of education as men, this response would have been galling. Emily eventually learned that women were only eligible for one form of higher education in Canada West, teaching college. And so, In 1853, Emily took her savings from teaching school to attend teaching school, that is, provincial normal school in Toronto. Unsurprisingly, her experience proved an asset, and she graduated with first-class honours in 1854. When she completed her studies, Emily was immediately hired by the Brantford School Board to be the principal of the Brantford Public School, the first woman to be appointed as a principal in what was then Canada West and is now Ontario. Emily returned to Norwich for the summer between completing the course and moving to Brantford. This period begins the separation of the 23-year-old Emily from Norwich, though the process took a number of years. After 2 years in Brantford, Emily married John Stowe, an immigrant from Yorkshire, England, to Mount Pleasant, Canada West. They were married in Norwich, but not at a Quaker ceremony. John was a Methodist, and it is likely that Emily became a Methodist for their wedding, which may have been performed by a Norwich Methodist preacher. In later life, however, Emily seems to have retained something of the Quaker idea of a personal, unmediated relationship with God, saying that she had outgrown all religious creeds despite looking upon Jesus Christ as our great exemplar. Emily resigned her position as principal upon her marriage in 1856, and in July 1857 moved back with her mother in Norwich to have her first child, Anne Augusta. After this lying in with her mother, Emily and John returned to Brantford, where the rest of their children were born. Emily's resolve to become a doctor was renewed when her husband fell ill with tuberculosis around the time that their third child, Frank Jennings, was born in 1863. She believed that women were well suited to become doctors, as was necessary in small frontier communities such as Norwich in the decades of her youth. 3 of the Jennings daughters eventually became doctors: Emily, Hannah Augusta, and Ella, and it is likely that their mother's influence can be seen in this interest. Cornelia, meanwhile, was supportive in other ways, moving to Mount Pleasant to support her nieces and nephews while Emily blazed the trail for her sisters, and later her daughter, to follow. In the pursuit of her medical career, Emily moved even further from Norwich, to the New York Medical College and Hospital for Women Homeopathic, although she was, of course, returning to the birth state of her mother and grandmother. After 2 years at medical school, Emily returned to the newly confederated Dominion of Canada in 1867. She spent several months in London as an apprentice to Dr. Joseph Lancaster, a Quaker and former Norwich rebel, before she established her own practice in Toronto, even though she did not have a medical license. Like her rebel relatives and inspirations, Emily understood that the law could be unjust and required resistance. In the 1870s, Emily's ties to Norwich weakened again as her parents sold the family home, although they continued to live with their daughters Paulina and Ethelinda, who had married Norwich men and remained in the area. After the death of her first husband, Cornelia had moved to Detroit to establish an antiques business, where she eventually married a lawyer. The youngest daughters, Hannah and Ella, were both firmly established in New York, medically trained although only Ella practiced. Hannah had married an American, Charles Kimball, but Ella remained single and successful as a medical doctor. Like their sister in Canada, the younger Jennings sisters pursued the cause of women's suffrage after completing their medical training. When Solomon Jennings died in 1881, he was buried not in Norwich, but at Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Toronto. His wife Hannah spent her last days visiting her daughters, and died in 1888 in New York, before being returned to Toronto and interred beside her husband. 3 years later, in 1891, Emily's sister Paulina died, the same year as John Stowe, her husband. Emily's actions as a doctor and a suffragist took her away from Norwich, as did the life paths of 3 of her 5 sisters. But the influence of her upbringing in a new isolated settlement among rebels and Quakers was clear in her resolve and commitment to her causes throughout her life. Raised to believe in radical equality and with the example of the enduring Norwich rebels, she applied these lessons to her experience in education, medicine, and the campaign for women's suffrage.